We now turn to our study of fiscal policy and try to understand the impact of different fiscal instruments, such as government expenditures, taxes, or debt, in the economy. Let's start with government expenditures. These amount to all that is spent at all levels of government for purchases of goods and services. Transfer payments, which are amounts given to households and business, and interest payments. In this graph we can see, for the euro area, how total expenditure, purchases, transfers and interest payments evolved since the creation of the euro all up to 2014. The first fact worth noticing is that government expenditures amount to about half of euro area GDP. This is well above the median of 156 selected countries of about 31%. There is some geographic pattern, with countries in Europe and the Middle East being above the median, and in contrast, countries in Africa being well below. The second fact worth noticing is also that its two largest components were the purchases of goods and services and transfers. Let's take a closer look at them. Here, we disaggregate purchases by the level of government. Most of them are executed at the state and local level, reaching about 11%, where purchases by the central government amounts to about 7% of euro area GDP. Looking at the second biggest item of government total expenditures, namely transfers, we can see that unlike with purchases, it is in fact the central government that makes the bulk of them, to about 14% of GDP, where state and local government transfers amount to about 5%. If instead we break down government expenditures by function, we see that the largest share goes to social protection, with a noticeable jump around the time of the Great Recession, from 18 to 20% of GDP, as you would expect. General public expenditures and health rank next, at about 7% each. Other important functions of the government, such as economic affairs and education, come afterwards, costing close to 5%. And then the remainders, public order and safety, environment protection, and others, cost less than 2% of GDP each. It is now time for us to think how government expenditures may have an impact on households' economic activity. Let GT represent government purchases in real terms for year T. Aggregate spending in the economy in goods and services is now given by investment plus private consumption and government purchases of goods and services. Let VT represent the government's real expenditure on transfers and capital T be the total real taxes collected by the government in year T. For now, let us assume that these taxes and transfers are lump sum. That is, there is nothing households can do that may affect the amount of transfers they receive or the amount of taxes that they pay. Assume also a balanced budget. We will relax all of this later, allowing for deficits, surpluses, and government debt, and also for distortionary taxation. But for now, let's keep those assumptions. This means that the government budget constraint is such that the government purchases of goods and services plus transfers must equate total taxes collected. Let us also set aside any asymmetries between public and private production, and thus assume that the government subcontracts all of its production to the private sector, and consequently, public investment, public-owned capital, and government employment are zero. Under these assumptions, the budget constraint for the household is still the same as before, with the exception of the fact that now it must take into account that the source of funds has to be augmented to take into account net transfers, that is, transfers from the government minus taxes paid to the government. Remember the government budget constraint from before. Rewriting this equation with respect to net transfers shows that if government expenditures rise by 1 unit, net transfers must fall by 1 unit, such that the constraint still holds. This shows that if government expenditures increase, households' disposable income will fall by the same amount. Going back to our analysis of permanent income hypothesis behavior to anticipate what would the impacts of an increase in government expenditures be, assume that these increase by $100 permanently. Let's consider for now that the labor supply of capital and labor is fixed. This implies a permanent income drop of $100, and consequently a fall in consumption by the same amount. The result is, in this simple framework, that government expenditures perfectly crowd out private consumption, and aggregate demand for goods and services will remain constant. So, what are the predictions of this framework? In terms of the supply side, nothing changes with a permanent increase in government expenditures. This is a demand side shock. In terms of aggregate demand for goods, nothing changed, as the model predicts that the government increase in government consumption will crowd out private consumption one-to-one. Neither supply or demand change, hence no changes in real wages, rental price of capital, or the interest rate. What if the change in government expenditures would be temporary instead? Say, a one-time increase in $100 going back to the previous level of expenditures the period after. Well, we can use again the same analysis to illustrate what the predictions would be. A temporary increase of $100 in government expenditures would lead to a temporary fall in income by the same amount. Given permanent income behavior, this income drop would be smooth across all periods, leading to a relatively small decrease in consumption and a larger decrease in savings and thus investment. Note that, as before, in terms of the supply side, nothing changes with a temporary increase in government expenditures. Again, it is still a demand-side shock. In terms of aggregate demand for goods and services, nothing changed, as the model predicts that the temporary increase in government consumption will be compensated by a larger drop in investment than consumption, but that once summed up, would leave aggregate demand unchanged. As such, neither supply or demand change, hence no changes in real wages, rental price of capital, or the interest rate exactly as before. These predictions, however, that changes to government expenditures would have no correlation with output is not confirmed by the data. As it can be seen in this picture showing the cyclical behavior of Eurozone real GDP and government purchases, the correlation is negative and amounts to about 0.21. There are a number of assumptions that we made, like fixed labor supply and the lump sum nature of taxes, that are empirically implausible and that once relaxed will lead to government expenditures that correlate with GDP. One possibility is also that the empirical data against which we tested the predictions of our model is a function of many other confounding factors that impede us of using it to have a fair test of our predictions. These might be variables that could be impacting both output and government expenditures at the same time, and that by not being taken into account, make the correlation we measured uninformative about the true causal impact of government expenditures on output. To try to circumvent that, we will resort to the sort of quasi-natural experiment data we alluded to at the beginning of the course. We will use wartime government spending in the US, which many authors consider to be a useful source of variation in government expenditures that is not dependent on other confounding factors or on the value of output itself. Focusing on World War II and the Korean War, real GDP was above its trend, but by less than the excess of real defense purchases from its trend. For example, in 1943 to 1944, the excess for real defense purchases of $537 billion was matched by an excess for real GDP of $433 billion. For 1952 to 1953, the numbers were $56 billion and $49 billion respectively. Since real GDP was up by less than defense purchases, the other components of GDP had to be below trend overall. In 1943 to 1944, the shortfalls from trend were $58 billion in gross investment and $20 billion in non-defense forms of government consumption and investment. Consumption was about equal to trend, and net exports of goods and services were about $23 billion below trend. We will study the role of net exports later, but for now note also that in 52 to 53, gross investment and consumption were each about equal to trend. Non-defense government consumption was $5 billion above trend, and net exports were $11 billion below trend. Consider how the equilibrium business cycle model relates to these wartime observations. The main discrepancy is that the model predicted no change in real GDP, whereas the data reveals substantial increases in output. The data also shows that rises in real GDP are by less than an increase in government purchases. That is, aside from military purchases, the totals of the other components of real GDP are down during wartime. The model accords with this pattern. However, the components of real GDP other than military purchases do not fall nearly as much as predicted by the model. The main failing of the model, and quite a striking one, is its prediction that real GDP would be unchanged during wartime. One source of this prediction is our assumption that labor input is fixed. However, as we can see in the data, employment did increase during each wartime period, and this increase was not limited to the increase in military personnel. This motivates the question as to why did employment increase during wartime. Economists have brought forward several explanations. One has to do with the fact that a large expansion of real government purchases means that households have less disposable income. The negative income effect predicts that households would decrease both consumption and leisure, which would imply an increase in labor supply. One problem with this argument is that consumption did not decrease much during the wars. Another alternative explanation, as argued by Casey Mulligan, is that labor supply increased due to patriotism. There were many campaigns aimed at motivating people to work more. Slogans as "Non-stop work will win," "Let's keep the factories going full steam ahead 7 days a week," "Are you doing all you can?" and "Our answer, all-out production," were used to that effect. The attraction of this argument is that it does not rely on a negative income effect, and thus we can have an increase in labor supply without the corresponding fall in consumption. The downside is that this is an effect that is expected to be more relevant in popular wars, such as the World War II, but not so much in other conflicts. Lastly, from the standpoint of families, the military draft not only increased the employment of many men, but for example, in the case of married couples, would also incentivize the increase in labor force participation and labor supply of women, as a consequence of postponing having children. The postponement of marriage would have a similar effect. Regardless of the strength of each argument, all provide rationales for an increase in labor supply during wartime. Such increase would, as the plot suggests, that labor supply would shift to the right, leading to an increase in equilibrium labor, but also providing a new prediction, that the real wage would go down. That was the case for World War I, as real wages dropped by 4%, but not in World War II or the Korean War. A first look at this might suggest that the model yet fails to deliver again, but this might not be the case. Price controls and rationing of goods were imposed during World War II, and to a lesser extent during the Korean War. Consequently, the reported price level understated the true price level. Households could not buy additional goods just by paying the stated price. To buy more goods, a household might have to pay the black market price, which exceeded the stated price and thus led to an overestimate of the real wage. What about real interest rates? An increase in labor supply makes capital more productive, leading to a shift in the demand for capital and an increase in the rental price. The no arbitrage condition would then imply an increase in interest rates. The fact is that not only this effect did not take place, but actually the opposite happened, if we take the yield on government bonds as reference. Again, patriotism was one argument used by economists, as large campaign efforts were made appealing to it by the government. Slogans as "Save freedom of speech, buy war bonds," or "You can't afford to miss either, buy bonds every payday," or "For all the brave, buy war bonds." All of these were used and may have provided a rationale for an increase in the demand for bonds and consequently to a fall in the interest rate. Another tentative explanation might rely on the phenomena of flight to safety. In war times, it is reasonable to assume that uncertainty increases a lot, and households might be tempted to buy comparatively safe assets such as government bonds, and this might explain why the rate paid on these assets is lower during wartime.